Hi again, and welcome back to the Space Invaders course. We're now made it to lesson number 8. So in this lesson we're going to finish off debugging the firing code. So remember, we have a problem at the moment whereby when we press the fire button and then press the fire button again, our missile keeps restarting at the player ship. So we're going to debug that bit of code now. Remember, in the last lesson we split everything up into our functions, so we'll see how that function breakup actually lets us focus in on single bits of code, which will make the debugging process that bit easier. So let's first of all have a look at the problem, and then we'll work out how we can fix that. So I'm going to start off in Take 80, and I'm going to load in our current lesson 7 code. And since we're going to be working on lesson 8, I'm going to first of all then save that as lesson 8. So we've got everything ready for this next block of work. So if I run that code, so our current program, so we have our player ship moving along the bottom of the screen here. And when we press our fire key, our Z key, we can see we have a missile fires up to the top of the screen. But if I press fire while it's halfway up, you can see that we simply are resetting our bullet, and that shouldn't happen. We should be able to fire a bullet, have it go to the top of the screen, even if we press fire again. But then once it's gone off the top of the screen, we then want it to be able to fire the second time. So let's see how we can get around this problem then. So let's have a look at the current code to see if we can spot where the problem is. So we've got our listing here. So again, we're on lesson 8, so let me just change that to lesson 8 while we're here. So we define our variables and our objects to describe our system. And then we have our tick function, where we are now calling our 4 functions which handle the complete software as it stands. And because we split up into functions, we know that since we have a problem with the bullet firing mechanism, it must lie somewhere, or there's a very good chance that it will lie somewhere inside this check player fire function. So if we scroll down a bit, we'll get to our check player fire function. Let me just switch to the smaller font size so that we can see the full lines. So the call to our check player fire function in our tick function, so remember that's the tick function is the game loop that happens 60 times per second. So this function check player fire will be called every time we go through that tick loop. And if we look at how this one works at the moment, it's got our if statement here. So it says if we have a new button press, so remember that the btnp command checks for a new press on the button. But if we have a new press, then we execute this bit of code which resets the player bullet back to the original player ship position. So it restarts the bullet. But this button press happens any time you press that button. So whatever is happening on the screen at the moment, if you press the button, the fire button, then the bullet will be reset. Now obviously that's not what we want. So let's have a look at how the system should be working and how we can possibly fix this bug. So when we're firing a bullet, we know that it's going to start at our player ship position. So we have our player bullet object, and we then define the position of that bullet using our subobject position. So we have player bullet position.x and player bullet.position.y. But we now need to let the system have some idea of when this bullet is actually in motion and when it's ready then for a new bullet to be fired. So we can add a new variable into our player bullet object, which is going to tell the system exactly this. We can call this active, and we're going to use it as what's known as a flag, which simply means it's a variable which is going to signal whether something is happening or has happened, so that we can see that that event has occurred. And I think of it very much like somebody waving a flag to catch our attention, to tell us something. So this flag is really going to have two values. A false value tells us that the bullet hasn't been fired, so we're ready for the next one to be fired. Or it's going to be true, which tells us that a bullet has been fired and that we have to wait then until it reaches the top of the screen before we can do any more bullets. And this sort of true-false variable is actually called a Boolean value. So that's a special type of variable which simply has a true, false, those are the only two possible values it can have. So when we first start then, our playerBullet.active variable is going to be set to false, telling us that we're ready for a bullet to be fired. Our position X and Y values, they don't really matter at the moment, so we can set them to 0 for convenience. But we do now have to slightly modify our drawing code, because there is a slight problem which you might not have noticed. If we drop back into our code, we can see that our checkPlayerFire function and our drawPlayerBullet function are both called every time we go through our tick loop. If we look at that code then, we'll see that in our checkPlayerFire button, we're updating the position of our bullet every single time, and we're also drawing the bullet on the screen every single time. And that actually creates a slight glitch, which you have to be careful to see if you can see it or not. So let's go back and let's run our code. And we have to watch very, very carefully in the top left corner. And if I slow that right down, you'll be able to see it a bit more clearly. So our bullet appears for a brief second at position 00 on the screen. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we've asked the software to do. It resets the bullet to position 0, and then our draw program simply draws it there, and it then moves off the top of the screen. So we need now to modify that bit of the code to only draw and update the bullet position if the bullet is actively being fired. So if our bullet.active variable is false, we just simply don't update the bullet and we don't show it on the screen. So this playerBullet.active variable, which we said we're using as a flag, it shows another way in which variables are used in our software. A lot of what we've done so far is storing information such as positions and so on. But this is now using a variable to communicate between bits of software. So our bullet software is going to be setting this flag, and that flag is going to be looked at by our drawing code and our movement code, and it's going to tell them whether they need to do something or not. So we're sending a communication message from one piece of software to another using a variable. And we'll see this later in the code as well, where we'll actually not just send sort of true and false values as flags, but also state values to tell the software what's going on in another part of the software. So let's get back to our bullet firing bug then, and let's see if we can get the rest of that sorted out. So we're currently in the state where we have just started. Our playerBullet.active flag is set to false, and we're now waiting for somebody to press the fire button. When the fire button is pressed, we're going to set the position variables to the player ship position, so that puts the bullet right at the very beginning. But we're also going to set this playerBullet.active flag to true, and that's going to signify that a bullet has now been fired, so that our update and drawing software now needs to put the bullet on the screen and start moving it. So whilst the bullet is active, we're going to get other key presses coming in, so people will hit the fire button. But our code now needs to ignore those until the bullet has finished completely and got to the top of the screen. So once our bullet hits the top of the screen, we're going to detect that, and we're then going to set the playerBullet.active value back to false. We can also then reset the position to 0, but because our updating and drawing code is looking at this playerBullet.active flag, it will simply stop drawing the bullet on the screen. So we're back now to our very start position, waiting for the next fire button press. So if we go back into our TIC80 code, and we can start to look at how we're going to implement this then. So the first thing to do in our player bullet object, we need to add in this active flag. So we're going to say active, and we're going to set that equal to false. And that's our starting position. So let's have a look at where we go from here then. So we have our check player fire function. So let's have a look in here. So in our check player fire function, and let me just switch across to our smaller font size. This is the bit where we're checking if the button is being pressed, and we then set up the bullet to begin its at the player ship. So we need to come in here and we need to do another if statement. So if, now we know that we have the player bullet dot, the player bullet dot active variable. But if we think about what we're doing here, player bullet dot active is true when we have a bullet going up the screen. And that's actually when we don't want to look at the button presses. So we actually want to do it when player button active isn't true. So we've got two ways of doing this. We could say if player button dot active equals false. Remember that we use, if we're testing if it's equal to something, we use double equals. So we can say if player button active equals false. Okay, that will give us the right way around. Or what we're going to do here is we're going to just use another way of doing this. Is we have what's known as the not operator. And what that says is if this bit, so the bit that comes after not, if player bullet active is not true, okay? So that tells us then the situation that we want to have here. So if player bullet active is not true, in other words, we're ready for a new bullet, then we want to do all of this. And what I'm going to do here is, because we're going to be inside an if statement, we just need to indent that one so we can see what's going on. And then down here, we have the end of our new if statement. So that is our not active, end of our not active if statement. So we now have, it will check our player fire, but if it's not, if the bullet is currently not active, then we will go and check for the button press and reset the bullet position. But if player bullet is active, then we just skip this and we don't actually monitor the fire button. Now, up until now, we've been putting our if expressions inside brackets. So we would normally do it like that. And that's a very good habit to get into, because it means that you can actually see where that is. But it's actually not required in Lua. So if you want to put them in. If not, don't. But I tend to leave them in, because it does make it easier to see where the if statements are, especially if you're chaining a few together. As we'll see later in our code, it makes it easy to work out which bits go with which. Okay, but it's up to you. But we now have our check player fire button is modified to use this bullet active variable. But let's have a look at how that works then. So we're looking here, so let's say that we haven't fired a bullet yet. So we come down here, player bullet isn't active, so this expression will pass. In other words, this expression will be true because we're not active. So we'll then have a look at the button being pressed, and if the button is being pressed, we will set the bullet position to the player ship position. But we now need to do one other thing. So as soon as we fire a bullet, we now need to signify that by saying this bullet dot active is going to be equal to true. Oh, having real problems with my typing today. Okay, so we check for a fire button. If the fire button's pressed, we reset the bullet but we also set this flag. And again, this flag is then going to tell the rest of the software that a bullet has been fired and is currently needs to be drawn on the screen. So let's have a look at that then. So if we come out and we run that, we should now find that if we press the fire button and then repress it, we don't get our second bullet being fired. But we now have the situation that our bullet has been fired, it's gone off the top of the screen, but as yet we haven't written any software that detects that. So the system is just saying that it's got a bullet in motion, but it's never going to hit the top of the screen because we just haven't written that bit of code yet. So let's put that in now as well. So back into our code. So we've started the bullet correctly, and we've set our flag correctly to tell them that a bullet has been started. But we now need to look at how we finish the bullet. So we've got our bit of code here which moves the bullet. And it makes sense to think that once we've moved the bullet, that's going to be the place where it's best to test if it has actually hit the top of the screen. Now, we need to start thinking about the structure of our code. So we've got a function which is checking for the fire button. But at the moment that function does checking for the fire button and moving the bullet. So it makes sense to actually split that and take the moving the bullet out to a different function. So let's create that new function. So let's put a function down here. And we're going to create a new function called move player bullet. And that's not going to take any parameters. And it's going to finish off end, and that's move player bullet. And we're going to copy this bit of code down into there. So I'm going to cut that out with Control X and put that down here with Control V. And then just put a couple of lines around it so it makes it easier to read. So we have our function here which is moving the player bullet. And let me just take out those spare lines, and that cleans that up. Okay. So we've taken this out to a separate function. So at the moment this function isn't being called from anywhere. So let me just copy that function name, and where we need to put it then is after we've checked the player fire button, that's when we need to move the bullet. So we now have that in there. So we move the player ship, and again that all happens in one go. We then check if the fire button has been pressed, and that now also checks if it's ready for a new bullet to be fired. And then we have our move bullet function being called. So let's have a look at the move bullet function. So here we are. Okay. So our function simply updates the Y position of that player bullet. But we now know that we only want to update that position if our bullet is active. So again, we're going to put in our if, and this time it's our player bullet dot active. So if our player bullet is active, then we're going to update our position. I just tabbed it in to make sure that it comes inside our if statement. And then that is the end of our if it's active block. Okay. So we now know that our bullet is not being drawn on the screen unless the system has told it that there is a bullet to be drawn on the screen. So we update our Y position. And after we update our Y position, that's really where we need to do our test to see if it's hit the top of the screen. So we can say if. So we know that the player bullet dot position dot Y, that tells us how far up the screen it is. And we know that if that has got less than 0, so in other words it's now moved off the top of the screen, that's when our bullet has finished its motion. So how are we going to signify that back to the rest of the software? And if you think about it, it's going to be quite simple. All we have to do is tell the system that our player bullet.active is false, because that is the flag that says whether a bullet is in motion or not. So we can simply say then, so player bullet.active, and we set that, or we assign a value of false to that. So if we think about it, we have our move player bullet function. So we're only going to try and move it if the bullet is active. If the bullet is active, we update the Y position to make it travel up the screen. And then once we've done that, we check if it's hit the top of the screen. And if it's hit the top of the screen, we're going to set our flag variable to false, and that will tell the rest of the software that the bullet has finished and it's time then to look for the new bullet. So there's one last bit before we test that. We've seen here that our draw player bullet function, again, we know that that only needs to draw it if our bullet is active, so we can do that while we're here. So again, we're doing our if player bullet.active. Oh, put an extra capital letter in there. So if player bullet.active, then we're going to draw this bullet. So again, I need to step that in by 1 because we've just put an extra if statement in. And then after that, we end that new if statement, and that is our bullet only being drawn on the screen when we have a bullet active. So let's have a look and see if that all works then. So come back out here and we run. If we fire a bullet, it travels and goes off the top of the screen. We should now be able to fire a second bullet. And if we press our button as it's going, you'll see that we only have one bullet on screen at any point in time. So that's now our player bullet firing mechanism working properly. And again, the important bit from this is that we've now seen how we can use these flag variables and various types of variables then to communicate the state of some action that's happening in our software, so that different pieces of our code can then pick up on that and then correct their behavior accordingly. So we've seen here in our drawing bullet, if our firing mechanism has said that there's a bullet on the screen, then we draw the bullet. If there's no bullet on the screen, then we simply skip over this and we don't draw the bullet. So that's got us then to a fully working bullet. So let's make sure that we save that work. So I'm just going to press Ctrl S to save that, because again, I saved it as lesson 8 at the very, very start of this lesson. So that's saved in there. And we're now ready to go on to our next lesson. So if we have a look at where we currently are in our code, so if I run that again, you can see that we've now got our bullet firing and that works just as we wanted it to. But it'd be quite nice if we were able to fire more than one bullet at a time. So instead of just one bullet going up off the screen, we could actually move around and fire a number of bullets. So that's what we're going to be working on in our next lesson, where we're going to start looking at what are known as arrays, where we can store multiple bullets inside a single variable. So get your thinking heads on for that one, because there's going to be a bit more coding to do, and I'll see you in lesson 9. Don't forget to visit the course pages for this project. There you'll be able to download the code for this lesson and get lots of extra hints and tips. You'll also get access to all my other programming, electronics and gaming projects. All the links are in the description below. For more games programming, electronics projects and retro gaming, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website.